Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to your postprandial digestif. Democracy disrupted? That's a question, not a statement, because we are all sojourners in search of the truth here. Now, to coin a cliche, the chair of this panel needs no introduction, but I'm going to give you one anyway. Commissioner Denham has been the Information Commissioner of the United Kingdom for just over 2.5 years, and it would be churlish to say that the country is lacking strong leadership at the moment, but it's not unfair to say that it's taken a Canadian to establish herself as one of the UK's genuine leaders. In fact, on New Year's Day, she became officially a commander of the British Empire. But everyone can relax because that's mainly an honorific title, I understand. Commissioner Denham has stewarded the ICO through extraordinary times with thorough, dogged, and forensic investigation into data analytics for political purposes, which includes but goes well beyond the activities of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. She's also the chair of the Executive Committee of the International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners at a critical moment in time for this global community. And in the words of Carol Cadwallader, the Guardian journalist, nobody does cool, calm, and collected like Elizabeth Denham does cool, calm, and collected. So please give a warm welcome to the very cool Commissioner Denham for her opening remarks.
Wow, no pressure. I better not mess up my speech now. Thank you very much for that invitation and introduction. I'm thrilled to be here at CPDP because this is my first time. And for years, I've heard about this conference, including from my good friend Charles Robb. You have to come here. It's a fantastic conference. I know it's really well supported by my academic colleagues and by the EDPS for years and years and years. My observation is that this is a very open conference and a provocative conference. The questions are deep. I'm learning things, but it also has a kind of Flemish academic rigor that I didn't quite expect along the way. The theme of the conference is also fantastic because, as Christian said, we've spent the last 18 months at the ICO laser focused on issues of data and democracy. Data protection is a core pillar of democratic society. And the subject of this panel sits at the intersection between the fundamental rights of data protection, freedom of expression, and fair and free elections. When I gave evidence before the Grand Committee of Parliamentarians in Westminster in November, and that was a Grand Committee of 9 jurisdictions representing 500 million people on this planet, it became clear to me just how international this issue of electoral interference is. And our work at the ICO is the start of something. It's the start of something. It's not the end. And that's why it's so important for us to be discussing these issues today at CPDP. When fundamental rights are undermined, regulators have to be dogged, they have to be forensic, and they have to be ready to act decisively. But it's a matter of resourcing, it's a matter of resolve, and it's a matter of results. But how did we get to here? The ICO's investigation, the actions that we've taken against platforms, against political parties and campaigns, data brokers, and data analytics companies, and our report entitled Democracy Disrupted, with policy and law reform recommendations alongside our enforcement action. It all started in March of 2017 as an area of media interest. And I remember one Sunday morning opening up the Observer and reading a newspaper report about alleged misuse of personal data in the context of the UK referendum campaign. And that raised a lot of questions for me. I had a feeling that there might be something here for the ICO to look at. So we then set about assessing the risks arising from the use of more sophisticated, invisible data analytics in the context of political campaigns. And what we discovered were algorithmic techniques that we've heard about as being the future of political campaigns were in fact already with us and far more widespread than the public and regulators expected. So it was clear to me that we needed to take enforcement action as well as make recommendations in policy and law reform to protect future campaigns. And so what that led to is really a twin-track approach in our work. And as a data protection authority, like many of my colleagues in the room, we have long understood the role of personal data in behavioral advertising in order to sell us trainers and cars and holidays. But in this investigation, we were taken by surprise at how easily and quietly that model has been transposed to digital campaigning, and how much money is being spent on these techniques and on digital campaigning. And this has happened without public understanding, without public debate on important ethical and legal issues. And what came next has been widely reported in the media. Our investigation then really intensified in early 2018 with whistleblowers and new evidence, and it involved more than 30 organizations, including household corporate names and high-profile individuals associated with the UK referendum campaign. And it really was extraordinary because there were allegations and denials being played out in real time on the news, in the media, by journalists every day. Discussions were happening on the floors of parliaments on both sides of the Atlantic, and then continued efforts of journalists and parliamentarians really helped build a full picture of the spider web of data movement. But as a regulator, our evidential standard is high, and it needs to be legally defensible. And when it comes to using our criminal enforcement powers, the ICO has to corroborate everything through an evidential lens. We learned a lot from this case, a galvanizing case, on how digital investigations need to be done. We seized servers and laptops and mobile devices. We accessed cloud-based records and data. And when you seize data, you need to think about having a secure evidential platform, and you need to think about forensic investigation capacity. It was a wake-up moment for me when I came into the office one Monday morning and realized that the front office had been turned into a police incident room, or what looked like one. I've also been alarmed by how long the tail is on some of the litigation that we've faced following our enforcement action. We also learned that the GDPR is just one part of the modernization needed for data protection regulators. GDPR has rebooted the law. It's enhance the sanctions that are available to regulators, but regulators also need practical investigative powers and tools that are going to work in the digital context. So how do we get to the sanctions in a legally defensible way? How do we obtain and preserve digital evidence in real time? We need new audit and investigation powers to be fit for purpose 21st century regulators. And at the outset of this investigation, I can say that the ICO wasn't properly equipped in this way. We had to endure a 3-day wait before a judge issued us a warrant to enter Cambridge Analytica. And when we did get into their offices with the now famous blue ICO enforcement jackets, the data that we seized amounted to 700 terabytes, or around 52 billion pages of text. So what this case was, is it was a real-life example of where our regulatory deficiencies lay and what we needed to be able to close those gaps. So at the 11th hour of the drafting of the UK's Data Protection Act, we were able to convince government and convince Parliament of the need for more modernized powers. No-notice inspections, streamlined warrants, digital freezing orders, emergency audits, and compulsion orders. So future investigations of large-scale breaches of the law will be intensive and they'll be costly. For data protection regulators in all of our jurisdictions. In the case of the use of data in political campaigns, we're talking about the risk to the integrity of our democratic processes, and that's just too important to leave unaddressed. I do see a reason for hope, though. The ICO's efforts have been followed closely by international counterparts. Law enforcement agencies at home and abroad are also engaged with this investigation. We've worked with the UK Electoral Commission to pioneer a close working relationship to protect the integrity of these processes. The common theme between the two bodies is transparency, and I'm sure that Louise is going to speak to these issues later on the panel. The ICO has also worked with the National Cybersecurity Agency on the cyber risks that we've uncovered. And this is exactly what the European Commission has called for in its electoral package, for cooperation between the authorities within member states. So the UK has really stolen a march on this recommendation because Cambridge Analytica and Facebook galvanized us in that direction. Other data protection authorities have taken confidence from our investigation in their own jurisdictions. We can't do this alone, and we're all learning from each other. Our upcoming European Parliament elections and the potential for further campaigns in the near future in the UK, who knows? It's critical that this issue is given urgent attention. So I've been asked, are we better prepared for future campaigns where digital campaigning and these sophisticated data analytic techniques are only going to increase? And I think we are. Regulators know what can go wrong, and we have the cooperation links in place. Big tech have taken some steps towards combating disinformation and misinformation. But I think we're also better prepared because we have more informed citizens, we have civil society and journalists and academics and fact checkers who are ready to probe and are ready to investigate. But there's more that we need to do. And the ICO, in our report, has called for a number of measures, including a statutory code of practice for the use of personal data in political campaigns, including legislative transparency in the use of data and the provenance of political ads, and including working with the universities in the UK on data governance issues to distinguish between public interest academic research and private interests. And further work is underway at the ICO that will have a positive impact on democratic transparency. We're taking the learnings from this investigation into an entire ecosystem where we're going to be looking at ad tech. So, responding to the threats of democracy is a huge challenge. The ICO does not have a monopoly on good ideas, but we've made a strong start with our decisive action over the last year. And on the panel today, you'll hear the views from academics, regulators, and the tech sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We're going to go into discussion now with our outstanding panelists to my left. I wanted just briefly to say that we at EDPS have been following the work of the ICO and other DPAs in this area very closely, as well as trying to highlight the importance of data protection in safeguarding trust in democracy. In fact, in the EDPS opinion from March last year, we went so far as to say that without the concentration of so much informational and market power in so few hands, the complexity and opacity and unaccountability of the ad tech ecosystem and the systematic abuse of personal data that this entails, we wouldn't all be talking about fake news at all, because it's human nature to tell fibs and manipulate. The difference now is the ease of doing it on such a massive scale. We thought that there was too much focus on transparency and taking down so-called misinformation, and not enough on responsible data processing. So the aim of this discussion is to shine a light on who is responsible for this situation and how we can start to fix it. Now you might recall that at the end of the first installment of The Matrix, Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, is lying comatose in Zion until Trinity gives him a big kiss and he's able to see and control the Matrix. That is the artificial simulation of what the world used to be before the robots took over. Now, the ad tech ecosystem, which has only been around for less than 2 decades, is a similar vast and complex phenomenon, predicted to account for $330 billion of global expenditure next year. We tend to focus in this conference on the impact of ad tech and other phenomenon on individual rights to privacy. But with Jason, who's going to speak next, the CEO of Digital Content Next, we have someone who can explain the impact felt by publishers of this ad-driven ecosystem, something which has been open to exploitation recently, only recently, by people with political agendas. So Jason, could you explain a little bit about what you do and try to imagine that you are Trinity and that the audience is so many Neos in need of a big matrix-revealing smack on the lips?
It's quite an image. Thank you. First, thank you for having me, the Commissioner's Office in particular. Good afternoon. So I'm Jason Kint. Just quickly, so you know who I am, I represent about 80 premium publishers for this organization, DCN. In our world, premium publishers are the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. We have European members like the Financial Times, The Guardian, BBC, ESPN, Disney, etc. But we represent the news and entertainment content ecosystem. I hope you listen carefully as much as you can to my remarks. I'm going to be as candid as you probably ever hear from an industry person. I traveled a long way, so I'm going to be frank. I have about 5 minutes they gave me to summarize what's going on in the digital ad marketplace. 4 key points for you. First, advertising is critically important to digital media. For our members, which represent most of the premium publishers, it's about 80% of their revenue. So about 80% of what pays for the content that you receive in the digital world. To put that against the 2 elephants that are in nearly every room I go into, Google, about 90% of their revenue comes from advertising. Facebook, it's almost 99% of their revenue. So that just backs up how important it is. Their lobbyists, particularly the big tech companies, and they consistently are out there saying that any changes to how digital advertising works will be the death of free content, it'll be the death of the web, it'll be the death of journalism. They are lying to you. There needs to be change. What's currently happening, it will not work long term. How has it changed over the last 2 decades? Automation, obviously. We got humans out of the picture. Buying, bidding, selling of advertising happens automatically. We call it programmatic. It's a fancy word for automation. Automation is a good thing. It unlocks capital, it unlocks efficiencies. It's a good thing for any supply chain, typically. It's not a bad development. We do have, as Christian mentioned, thousands of third parties where we've created this kind of patchwork ecosystem. It's really trying to copy what Google and Facebook are able to do to allow the rest of the ecosystem to compete. Facebook and Google basically can do it all on their own. There is a commercial problem that is playing out. DCN has very much documented. We did the original analysis about 3 years ago now, where we framed what we called the duopoly, and we did the analysis that said 85 to 90% of the growth in our marketplace is going to 2 companies. So if you think about the European and North American market, there's about $150 billion of digital advertising. 85 to 90% of the growth is going to 2 companies. That's not good for any market, right? Why? Why do they get so much of the growth? These 2 companies are able to collect and use data in a way that no one else can. It's the source of their power and their dominance. The digital ad marketplace has been built around micro-targeting individual users and audiences, importantly, wherever they can, as cheaply as possible. Google has tracking tags on about 75% of the top 1 million websites, so basically anything you do today as a common user, they're going to know what you did. Facebook has tags on 8.3 million different publisher sites. We know that actually from the good work of the DCMS committee in the UK. That was part of the evidence. Of course they're winning. If you want to dig into this deeper, just a quick plug. We actually published and distributed some research from a professor at Vanderbilt University. If you go to Google and you search for Google data collection, it'll be the first link back, which is like one of my great little fun wins, is that you'll get a 80-page research paper from an academic. Doesn't take a position on whether or not it's good or bad, but it systematically documents all of their practices. Intermediaries that can actually track behavior across most of the web are the ones that are winning. The companies that sit in the middle. There is opacity by design in the way that digital advertising works. There's margin in that mystery. If you think about that, you have a market where you have advertisers on one side, you have consumers and users on the other. Everyone in the middle is trying to maximize their own profit, their own welfare. It has to come from somewhere. It's coming from the advertisers, and it's coming from the consumers. Again, Google and Facebook being the biggest winners. A bit more controversial, I like to argue that Google, in the way that the advertising marketplace supply chain works, they essentially have a rigged market. Every single phase of the supply chain, they dominate. The buying, the selling, the transaction, and the measurement. If this was the financial sector, they would be the market maker, the inventory creator, the stockbroker, the stock exchange, the investment banker, every single aspect. You wouldn't normally allow that. For some reason we do, because it's data and it's advertising. So why should you care? Competition interests now more than ever actually intersect with data policy. The misalignment means that those that are benefiting from the revenue and the profit of the industry are not aligned with what the consumers are actually seeking out in digital. The acceleration to automation has actually surfaced a lot of symptoms. Malware, bots, bot fraud, ad blocking to try to get out of it, clickbait, privacy issues, more recently, disinformation. These are all symptoms, though. It's very important to understand those are all symptoms we're talking about. The core problem is the unbridled data collection at the most personal level, imagined on the most personal object you could ever have on your persona, on your person. Most important to me, and I imagine my final point, and I imagine to a lot of the people in the room, it's at odds with what pays for newsrooms and journalists. We had over 1,000 journalists last week get laid off in the United States. As much as you believe that journalism and trust and facts and truth are the antidote for misinformation, this matters, the concentration of power from these two companies back in America. So your work over here is very important on this. They're able to operate in a way that they choose and to actually get all of the benefits. So the enforcement of GDPR is vitally important, especially around limiting the purposes and how they're able to use data across their ecosystem. Lastly, it's one thing in the UK, it's one thing in the EU, it's one thing in the United States, but when you combine authoritarian governments with social media, disinformation, weaponization of ad tech, you get really bad, toxic combinations. I had a speaker at an event that we ran earlier this week in Florida. If you just look up her story, she was Time Person of the Year, Maria Ressa. She runs a news business back in the Philippines. She's currently indicted by the government there. It's all around using social media and disinformation to actually intimidate her. And so that's a real world outcome. We don't want that to spread to our parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to Louise now from the Electoral Commission of the UK or England and Wales, sorry. The UK, yeah. The ICO's Democracy Disrupted report makes a number of recommendations around political campaigning, and some of them involve the Electoral Commission. What role can you play, Louise, in improving transparency in the use of data in elections?
Thank you. Very good question. Just to introduce myself, my name is Louise Edwards. I'm the Director of Regulation at the UK's Electoral Commission. What we do is we oversee elections and referendums in the UK, including enforcing the laws on political campaign finance. Now, my starting point in answering the question is that transparency is key for us. And by that, I mean transparency of money. The UK's regulation of political campaigns is based on voters knowing where the money for parties and campaigners comes from and how it's spent. So, for example, parties and campaigners in the UK must be registered before they can stand candidates in elections or spend lots of money on campaigning. We maintain that register and it's public. Parties and campaigners can only use money from the UK to fund UK political campaigns, and the source of large donations must be publicly reported. During elections and referendums, parties and campaigners must stay within spending limits, and they must report to us an itemised list of every single campaign payment afterwards. Again, we then publish that. This is a system that is already based on maximum transparency for voters, and the Electoral Commission plays a very fundamental role on that. Already, a voter can go to our website, look up a particular party, see who runs it, see where their money comes from, and see what they've spent that money on. They can go to another part of our website and see details of all the investigations we've run whenever people have broken the law. But, and it's a big but, these rules were written in 1999, before Facebook or Twitter, before social media. The last decade alone has seen an explosion in the use of digital tools for political campaigning, and the technology available for campaigning has radically changed. Just to give you some figures, in the 2015 general election in the UK, 23.9% of reported advertising spend was digital. In the 2017 general election, it was 42.8%. But we've also had very major inquiries into how those digital tools have been used and misused. This includes our investigations into campaigners in the UK's 2016 EU referendum, which have resulted in ongoing inquiries by the police and the National Crime Agency. So digital campaigning has clearly created challenges for the transparency of political campaigning. What can we do about that? Well, the first thing we can do is try and understand the context that we're operating in. Political campaign finance in the UK is already subject to a rigorous legal framework that is predicated on transparency. It's also really important to remember that political campaigning is a good thing. And digital campaigning has revolutionized political engagement. It gives a voice to people who wouldn't normally take part, and it's contributed to some of the highest levels of engagement in elections that we've ever seen in the UK. So, for example, the turnout at the general election in 2017 in the UK was the highest for 20 years. The other point I just want to make is that the majority of parties and campaigners who get involved in politics want to do something good. Most of the people who are out campaigning are volunteers. They want to make a difference in their communities, and they want to do so within the law. So we, as the Electoral Commission and all the regulators in this space, have a challenge to think about how to balance people's freedom to campaign, to express their political views, with the very clear need for increased regulation and protection. Now, what else can we do? Secondly, we can point out some of the gaps in the current laws. So parties and campaigners don't have to tell us what they spend on digital campaigning. We can look at how much they spent on certain platforms like Facebook, Google, or Twitter. But we know there's digital spend via other companies, via other agencies. In the 2016 EU referendum, for example, more than 3.5 million was spent with Aggregate IQ, who then placed their ads with Facebook. And there's a real challenge in how voters can link the spending reported to us with the messages that they're actually receiving on their phones or whatever device it is. In the UK, printed election material has to have what's called an imprint that says who paid for it, but online election material doesn't. So a voter can receive a political advert, but there's no requirement to say who sent it to them or who paid for it. This is a big problem for the voter, but it's also a problem for us as a regulator. Digital tools mean that messages can be disseminated very quickly, they can be tweaked and updated in real time. We saw this again, I'm going to go back to the Brexit referendum, where one campaigner managed to spend £675,000 on digital ads in the last 10 days of the campaign alone. This is very hard for us to monitor in real time, particularly if it's combined with a lack of imprints. It means we don't know if certain individuals or groups are racking up a lot of spending across multiple online campaigns. Now, what can we do to meet these challenges? We're very clear that we think that political campaigning rules need urgent reform. Last year, we set out some detailed proposals for that reform in our report on digital campaigning, and I'd just like to mention some of them very briefly. The first, and a bit of a no-brainer for us, is that imprints should be required by law on online campaign material. People want to know who's targeting them. In order to ensure a common standard for that transparency, we think there should be legislative reform in this area. We also think that it's too long to wait 6 months for parties and campaigners to report their spending to us so we can then publish it for the voter. And the way that that spending is reported needs to be brought into the digital age. We think our powers to enforce the law need enhancing. Unfortunately, we weren't lucky enough to get additional powers recently, but the sorts of things that we want are the ability to tell social media companies to take down pages or profiles if they're breaking the law. We want a significant increase in our penalties in order to deter people from committing offences in the first place. At the moment, we can only fine parties and campaigners £20,000 per offence. But if you're running a campaign that's spending hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of pounds, that very quickly just becomes a cost of doing business. And finally, and this is something we can do ourselves, we're looking to become a prosecuting authority. That's quite common in the UK for a lot of regulators to bring prosecutions. It's a new area for us, but it's one that we think will have a significant deterrence effect. So I'll conclude now, just to say that I think the UK should be proud of its system and its democracy and the transparency that already exists around campaign finances. But we need to protect the system, and it does need reform. Last year in the UK, in 2018, we celebrated 100 years of some women getting the vote. And the women who struggled so hard for that right knew how important democracy is. So when people begin to question their confidence in the system and question the actions of some who are in it, it is vital that we take action to maintain that confidence with rules that are properly fit for a digital age and with the powers to enforce them.
Thanks, Louise. I'm going to turn to Martin now. Now, Martin, we first met on a panel at an event called America's Monopoly Problem, and it was just a few days after the Brexit referendum. And I remember that part of our shock at the result was that from our respective Facebook timelines, it would have appeared that the vote would have been won by Remain by about 9-1. So you've recently published, I think, your second book. I see a copy of it there, called Democracy Hacked, Political Turmoil and Information Warfare in the Digital Age. It's been highly praised, and we'd like to have your views on whether you consider the decline and fall in revenue and profitability of many news organizations has affected our information environment, and also whether you think that it's enabled disinformation to spread, and to what extent, third question, to what extent do you think that the structures and incentives within social media, for example, and the way that the algorithms work, encourage or discourage misinformation and disinformation?
Thank you very much, Christian. I'll try and do all three if I can. So I'm Martin Moore. I'm at King's College London, where I run a centre called the Centre for the Study of Media, Communication and Power. And I've just written a book called Democracy Hacked. And there's a chapter in the book, the title, The Unbearable Lightness of Twitter. And I think, to your question, Christian, that sort of captures where I think we are, or where we're certainly going, in terms of the news and information ecosystem. In the sense that, on the one hand, it is fast, it's agile, it's light, it's almost weightless in many ways. And there's some significant benefits to that. We have, I think we shouldn't, we tend to get too depressed and negative about some of the new information environment, but actually that has some real benefits, for example, in terms of responding to natural disasters. The tools that are now available on Twitter, on Facebook, and elsewhere that allow both the emergency services and individuals to respond and react to natural disasters is remarkable, and communicate news about natural disasters. But on the other hand, the other side of it is that we've seen this essentially a loss of a whole layer of the news and information ecosystem, or we're losing a whole layer of the information news ecosystem. And that is, if you like, the more regular, slightly repetitive, in some ways mundane, but very necessary reporting that happens particularly at a local level in most democratic societies. It's what the Americans refer to as beat reporting. And I liken it in a way to bees in the natural environment. So, bees, which we don't really think of that much as being critical to the natural environment, and then we discover that they're declining, and then we discover that if they disappear, then actually the food supply will collapse. And I suppose I see beat reporting and particularly local journalism and certain types of journalism as a similar sort of layer in the ecosystem, and that once you take that layer out, then it deprives you of a foundation on which so much other news and information and public life and public affairs is built. And I'll just give one example because I think it's a particularly good one. I spent a bit of time down in South Wales in a town called Port Talbot. And Port Talbot in the 1970s had 11 journalists based in Port Talbot and reporting from Port Talbot, a dedicated local newspaper plus other competing newspapers from nearby. That declined over the course of the 80s and 90s. In 2009, the dedicated local paper, the Port Talbot Guardian, closed. And then shortly afterwards, there were no journalists, professional journalists, left in Port Talbot. Not a single one. There were 2 journalists in Swansea who would occasionally go into Port Talbot, but they were not going regularly to council meetings or elsewhere. And I happened to be working with Rachel Howes, who was doing a doctorate, looking at the effects that this would have on a local community. And what was really striking was not only the degree to which people felt uninformed and felt the normal things you'd expect, but the effects that it had on social cohesion, and particularly on a local anger towards authorities, towards the local council, because they weren't familiar with them. They didn't know who they were. They didn't know who the people were. They were much more open to believing stories about them and unable to check them. And Rachel said the fascinating thing: when you now have like a police cordon or something outside a school. For whatever reason, there was a fire in the kitchen, or immediately rumors just go wild on social media. And there is no professional reporter there to go in and to speak to the authorities and to find out exactly what happened and then to report on it. And so the rumors go unchecked. And so there are a whole series of rumors about this drug cartel in Port Talbot and various other false stories that have taken flight partly as a result of this. And this is not just a UK phenomenon. I've looked across a lot of societies. Thessaloniki last year lost its last major newspaper, so it has no major newspaper in Greece's second biggest city. It's happening across the US. So you have this, as I say, you have this sort of removal of a layer of the news information ecosystem, and I think that undermines the foundations. I'll just go briefly to the second question, because I think it does speak to part of this whole discussion around disinformation and misinformation. I think we have to recognize that, as Jason said, it's not simply that the ad tech ecosystem is complex and difficult and dominated by these two behemoths. It's also that it's structured in such a way that encourages and enhances aspects of disinformation and helps to undermine aspects of more authoritative news. To give one particular example, because I spent a morning a few weeks back in a digital ad agency, and I asked them to walk me through a Facebook campaign that they were running and a Google campaign that they were running. And I stopped them at one point when they were going through the tools, and I said, can you just show me that button again? And there was a button which I hadn't seen before, which was minimize cost per click. Minimize cost per click. Now I said, talk me through that. And essentially, and Jason, please tell me if I misunderstood this, but essentially, what you're asking the tool to do is to redirect your advertiser income to the lowest cost sites that you can, because you just care about the eyeballs. You care about the 35 to 45-year-old woman who happens to be looking at the screen at that point. You don't care if she's on The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Times. You just want to get those eyeballs, and frankly, if you can get them cheaper, why not get them cheaper? So there's a structural element to the tools that deliberately diverts money away from some of the more authoritative sites to some of the more fringe sites. I could go on at much further length about some of the structures, but I think I'll pause there, because I think we need to have perhaps a broader discussion around how to find a way to, because to Jason's point, I mean, my own view is that this is far bigger than simply tweaks. This is not about changing one or two things about ad tech, or even about, of course there'll have to be a greater level of regulation. This is about, as Shoshana Zuboff I think will talk about in a short while, this is about a huge and fundamental way in which much of our news and information is now funded across, we say the digital world, but the digital world is now across essentially our world. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Now, Lisa Maria, we're very interested in what you're going to say, because you work at the Oxford Internet Institute, their project on computational propaganda. And I understand yours is the first research project to have looked into what was going on in the Brexit referendum and in the 2016 US presidentials. Your work involves investigating the extreme end of propaganda and internet personalization and automated propaganda, political bots, etc. So could I invite you to sort of pull that, to sort of juxtapose your research against what we've been trying to do in the data protection space by reforming the rules for legal processing of personal information? Do you think that the GDPR is going to help fix this? Is it going to fix it? In particular, do you think that the fines are going to make a difference? There was the first big fine announced last week from the French regulator. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Christian. Wonderful to be here. I'm Lisa Maria Neudert. I'm a researcher with the Oxford Internet Institute, and I am working for their project on computational propaganda. We are a research project. We have been around since 2014, and we are actually looking into how automation, how algorithms are being used to manipulate the public. We have been looking into that for quite some time already. So we not just started in the US and with the Brexit referendum, but we've actually seen how these techniques have been starting to build up over years and years before that, and basically really since social media has been around. What we're trying to achieve as a project is to do social science research in real time. So to look into when we have an election, when we have a referendum, what is going on social media, how are people being manipulated, but we also want to understand the technology behind it that is really giving the entire thing a platform, and we also want to understand what the social implications of that are. So, Christian, you have asked specifically whether GDPR is helping with personalized advertising, is helping with personalized propaganda. Sadly, I have to say the majority, the absolute majority of personalized propaganda that we are seeing online will be fully legal and fully GDPR compliant. And we will have users who have specifically given their consent to be targeted with such personalized propaganda. So how can it be? You will rightfully say now, nobody in their right mind would give their data to a bad actor, to an evil manipulator, and then want to be targeted with propaganda. You're absolutely right. But we know how consent works with the GDPR is often that it's just a tick box, and that often this tick box is necessarily to use services like Facebook, like Twitter, like Google. And when we are doing that, we are basically signing away our data in a way that makes it possible for propagandists to use that data, to access that data, to target us with political misinformation, and to target us with evil content, with evil propaganda contents. So are these bad actors accessing our data, you may ask? No, they're actually not. So at no point do we have a propagandist who's getting their hands on the actual data that Facebook, that Google and co are collecting. But instead, what they are doing is that they're going to the advertising platforms that, for example, Facebook, Google, Twitter are having. And then how that works is without actually ever accessing personal data, without ever getting their hands on their very personal individual data, they're just playing around with a couple of buttons that was just described by Martin and are targeting an audience. And they can, for example, target 14 to 16-year-olds who have shown signs of depression. That is actually something that is possible to do with Facebook's advertising platform. That is not something that I've made up, but this is something that as an advertiser, as a marketer, or as a propagandist, you can do. So it's possible to single out vulnerable populations, to single out populations whom you think are an audience for your propaganda by using completely GDPR compliant and legal data, and without actually being the person, being the entity that is collecting that data. And I think that itself is really twisting around the entire notion that we're having of consent in the GDPR. I think with that, I want to open the discussion to our audience and to our panel as well. I think the interesting thing that I really want to emphasize here is, on the one hand, the issues that we are having with consent and GDPR, and also the notion that personal data and sharing your personal data is also often something that you don't necessarily understand about how you're doing it and how you're signing it away. Thank you.
Thank you. You raise an important point about the role of consent and how it's being used under the GDPR, and I'm sure that there will be some reaction from the floor on that. Before I open to the floor, we've got about 23 minutes. If I may. Could I ask one general question, and any of you can pick this up? But we've started to talk about, each of you have raised a possible thing that we could do, including the chair. The question is, do we need incremental steps, better enforcement, or do we need something more radical? The reason I ask is that given the role of the big platforms, do we think that they're basically conflicted in trying to fix this problem? Given that the eyeballs, rage, division, polarization drives engagement, and that is at the heart of the business model. So is that something that can be fixed? There is an argument which is gaining traction in the political realm on both sides of the Atlantic, that basically we've reached the point where these monopolies or these dominant companies are just too big and you have to break them up. So that's a question for you. And then, again, related to that, another radical solution, Jürgen Habermas spoke about the public sphere, where discourse takes place freely between citizens. That has moved into the digital realm, as we all know, and it's in a handful of platforms, not necessarily the biggest ones, but they're basically those and a couple of others. There aren't many. Should we be looking at, we have an established principle of media pluralism, certainly in the EU. Should we be thinking about platform pluralism as a principle of law? So anyone want to pick up on any of those points?
Just jump in there quickly, because I think there's an important point here. Of course they're too big. Of course they're too big. But equally, to what we were discussing earlier, if you don't address some of the underlying problems, particularly with the model, then you're actually the scale is not going to solve the problem. There is no. I'm happy to be proved wrong, but as far as I know, there are no normative goals for any digital ad model that I know. There's no digital ad model that says this is news you ought to consume because it's good for you. In fact, for most part, digital ad models say, you like sweets? Here, have some more sweets. Have some more cream. So yes, to your other point, which is that are the structures of the ad tech model, are they structured in such a way to make it extremely difficult to see how on earth they could resolve aspects of this? Yes, they are, which makes me believe that there needs to be fundamental and radical shift.
I would just, to weigh in on the first two parts of your question and flip it back to the audience real quickly. So enforcement, definitely, that's what we need. And consent is supposed to be informed and specific. If I ask the audience, raise your hand if you use any sort of Google product. Everybody raises their hand, right? Okay. Raise your hand if, of course, when you search on Google, you would expect searching on Google that they would target ads back to you. You search for Toyota, you're going to get a Toyota ad. That makes sense. I don't think there's a lot of disagreement on that. But raise your hand if you believe while you travel across the web and carry your device everywhere you go that you'd be okay with them collecting all of that data on you. Raise your hand if you're comfortable with that idea. No one is, right? So, but I guarantee you that 90-some% of you probably have given them consent to do that. So we have to solve that gap. And if we can't, then there's a good argument you need to break them up, because they're using the bundling power of their services to get you to do something you don't really want.
I would like to jump on that point, if I may. I think Jason just very powerfully demonstrated how unavoidable those networks are, how unavoidable Google is, and how unavoidable Facebook is. And that's also where a lot of that power and that attraction of those networks lie in. Because the larger a network, the larger, for example, the group of people that are on Facebook, the more attractive it gets to join it, the more valuable gets that network. Because the network is governing access to people. I know without using Facebook, without using WhatsApp and Instagram, I would be disconnected from a couple of people because I simply do not have any other means to reach them anymore. And this is really the status where a network has become unavoidable. This is an issue, but this is also where it gets very difficult to break them up. So I think breaking these platforms up right now, that's a solution that is being discussed widely in politics, but also in media. What I haven't yet heard is a feasible solution for how to break them up. And a couple of other issues that come to mind when we're talking about a platform pluralism. first of them is competition. I think it's often brought forward there's little competition, which is something that I would actually like to challenge. So we do have quite a lot of new platforms and quite a lot of new social media networks that have only grown in the last couple of years. So for example, we have something like Snapchat, but we also have something like TikTok, which is being widely popular with younger people. So there are alternatives to using these platforms. There are also alternatives to using WhatsApp. There is Signal, for example, there is Telegram. So those are some of the conditions that are not fully in place. And the most important, and the thing that I think we as a society really need to think about most, is do we have an advantage as a society when we don't have that one common marketplace of information anymore? Because there are sustainable benefits to having it that come from having information and that come from having access to people in one place.
Thank you. Louise, did you want to?
I just want to come in from thinking of it from the perspective of the voter. There's something about making sure that there's a consistent approach to the transparency which the voter has about how they are getting information over various social media platforms. And there's two sides to that. One is about future-proofing, so making sure that whereas we may be talking about breaking up the currently big platforms, what we actually need is an approach that means any social media platform that enters a certain sphere, it being political campaigning in my world, that level of consistency of the information they have to provide the voter is there. And from our mind, the only way to really do that is through legislative reform, preferably big bang rather than incremental, but I guess that's just about how quickly you have the impact. The second really important thing for us is about how you then equip the voter with the tools to properly, critically assess the information that they're being given. Part of this is simply knowing who's paid for it and who sent it to them. Another huge part of it is knowing why it's been sent to them, going back to the issue of consent around how their personal data is being used in this way. You put those two things together, there being a common approach to transparency and a voter who is able to access the tools to really critically assess what they're looking at. I think that would be a very, very powerful way of making sure that we're allowing the benefits of political messages going across the digital world without sort of allowing people to be opened up to some of the more manipulative approaches which unfortunately some actors use.
Thanks, Louise. I'm going to open up to the floor. Two questions that you might want to think about are following what's just been said. I mean, obviously got the consent point and how that's working. Also, we always use the word political, but what do we mean by political now? One thing that's very striking that Chris Wiley said, the whistleblower from Cambridge Analytica, was that even fashion decisions, preferences, those are interpreted as indicating political affiliation. So at what point does sort of purely commercial or social activity become political? Johnny in the audience grabbed my eyes first, so I think he has a question.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for a great panel. First, on the question of competition and breaking up companies, I'm not sure one actually needs to break up the giants if one enforces purpose limitation once softly, lets the user break them up. Every time that there is a controversy, if purpose limitation is enforced, this will harm the ability to cross-use data for a large company. So there's something missing there in the enforcement, and I'd suggest there's actually something missing there in Article 4 of the regulation. We need to know where a purpose actually ends. The big hole in the GDPR, something to think about for the review. A question for the chair. It is very heartening to hear you reaffirm that ad tech is, a priority. I don't know if it's priority number one, but certainly up there on the agenda for you. That is wonderful. Some of my colleagues have a complaint before you in the UK. I have a complaint in Ireland, and other colleagues have complaints in Poland. And the area of our concern is very much ad tech, but it's an area that, for example, the OII has not yet engaged in, and it hasn't really come up in the democracy disrupted debate. And the topic is bid requests. It's the invisible, massive elephant that dominates every room. We cannot have the disruption of democracy if we do not have the widespread profiling of voters. And when you have a bid request system that is not leaking, but broadcasting what everyone is reading, their browsing history, this enables that to happen. And if that's happening at the scale that those who do it advertise on their websites, the conservative estimate I heard recently from the New Economics Foundation in December was that in the UK, your browsing history is broadcast widely to tens or hundreds of companies on every page load 164 times per day. So time to stop focusing just on Twitter and Facebook. I mean, we need to worry about those things, but the people who are doing the targeting on those platforms are getting the data from our web browsing anyway. So I very much hope that that is an area of concern, this area of the ad auctions. And it would be wonderful to hear some elaboration on that priority area of ad tech for you. Thank you.
I think our focus on ad tech came from our investigation into Democracy Disrupted, and we started to realize that there was a much bigger elephant in the room that we need to look at. So we're at the early stages. We've got complaints that we're looking at, but we're also going to be having a session with industry players, with civil societies, and with others that are involved in the industry so that we can really understand it. But I think don't give up on GDPR yet, because I do think there are tools in the GDPR, including accountability and including purpose limitation, and that we have the powers to go in there and to make some changes.
Thank you. Could I just ask who would like to ask a question, because maybe we want to group them 1, 2, 3. If we could take them all together, and then we can to the panelists.
Okay. Thanks. Hi, I am Alexander Fanta. I'm a journalist with Netzpolitik, the German news website that focuses on digital rights, and I follow political advertising and the debate around it a lot in the recent months. But what always struck me when I heard Elizabeth Denham describe what her authority is doing and has been doing, and what kind of powers she says are requisite to control and to track what is happening. So in most kind of continental European countries, you don't have that kind of electoral transparency that the UK has in the first place. So Germany doesn't have like strong laws that force parties to disclose how they're spending, and it's also the campaign, the party finance is a bit murky in the first place. So I mean, how are legislators and data protection agencies in countries like Germany are even supposed to remotely kind of control that? And you're privy to the debates in the EU Commission's electoral network. So I wonder if you get any sense of are all these continental European countries, or many continental European countries, even remotely prepared to deal with a Cambridge Analytica type situation in the European elections that are coming up?
Thank you.
Hi, Alicia McDonald of Carnegie Mellon University. I'm going to posit that transparency is what we do at a policy level when we either don't know how to solve a problem or aren't willing to solve the problem. We push the costs back onto either researchers or the individuals involved and try to let them figure it out. We know that if you correct people that they have misimpressions, that later on they walk away with their impressions more strengthened. I think that it would be great to tag ads as where the money comes from. I think transparency is important and worth doing. But my question to the panel is, what are we going to do to actually address the problems? Because I don't think transparency is enough to get democracy back on track.
Andrew Adams of Meiji University in Tokyo. My question is primarily for Louise, but the others may wish to comment on this. You talked about the limitation on where the money comes from in campaigning, but that's still an old-fashioned thing in that we know for certain that certain foreign agencies have been involved in directly advertising to British voters, particularly during the 2016 referendum in the UK. And that's not something that can be tracked through the money coming in through any of the official campaigns, the registered ones. And I'm wondering what is going to be being done on that to address this direct advertising and direct interference from foreign entities into electoral processes in these countries?
Thank you. Those are all excellent questions. So we've got the work of the new election network, which has been set up by the European Commission. I mean, I can perhaps answer that briefly. That it met for the first time, I think, last Monday. It's a network of networks, if you like. So the Commission has recommended that in every member state, contact points from data protection, audiovisual service regulators, election commissions, they meet together in their own national network, and then they appoint someone who can be the contact point for the country, who then meets regularly in a meeting convened by the Commission. So that's what they're doing. They've only had their first meeting to try to decide how they're going to work together, but I understand they're going to be meeting quite frequently as we go forward, and it's a question of watching that space. We've also set up something called the Digital Clearinghouse, which is trying to bring regulators together across the world to look at what's happening in digital and how to fix common problems. The other 2 points for you were on was Alicia's point about transparency not possibly being an avoidance of addressing the real problem, and then the point about foreign agents, which I don't think has been touched on yet. So, like foreign interference in elections and votes. Who wants to take those?
I think I'm probably best placed to start off. I don't think that transparency is a way to not solve the problem. I think actually that transparency can be a very important end in itself for a number of reasons. First of all, because it, by definition, allows voters to have information about political campaign finance. But second of all, because it has a very big deterrence effect. Now, we, as the sort of enforcer of the UK's political campaign finance rules, and it is a finance system, have a very large amount of what we call real-time regulation that goes on, trying to solve problems before they become bigger problems, trying to understand what political parties and campaigners are doing, step in, bring them within the law before they break it. And actually, we're very successful at doing that. And part of it is about the onus that transparency puts on parties and campaigners to actually talk to us about what they're doing. Now, as I said at the start, you have to remember that there are 390 registered political parties in the UK. The majority of people who are involved in politics want to do things right, and they want to talk to us, and they want to understand the law. That is not to say that if somebody wants to break the law, they're not going to come and talk to us. That's fairly obvious. But there we can identify gaps in transparency and go and seek out why there are those gaps. So I don't think that transparency is an excuse for not solving the problem. I think it's a very important part of solving the problem for us. I'll just touch very briefly then on sort of foreign agencies. First of all, I should say that we have not been made aware of any significant foreign interference in UK elections or referendums now. But what I would say is we think that particularly the use of companies to make donations is an area that needs looking at. The idea of a world where there are hugely international company structures creates a possible risk in the UK of money being funneled through those companies and then ending up in a UK political party or campaigner having come from a UK registered company. Which is why one of the things that we would like to see happen is for the government to introduce legislation to say that donations to UK political parties must be made from UK-generated turnover in order to try and plug that gap. The last point I'll make is that as a UK-based regulator, our remit only extends to the shores of the UK. So unfortunately, when it comes to people from outside of the UK seeking to advertise within it, this is an area where we have to look to cooperation with colleagues outside of the UK to solve that particular problem.
In terms of the trust transparency question, transparency, I agree, is not the end solution to the bigger problem of the way the ad market works and the incentives. And trust often gets confused with that, but it's super important. And so the GDPR has these purpose limitations and tools that properly enforce. In the US, we don't have any laws for the most part yet, outside of emerging ones in California, but we will. And the more we restrict the ability to use that data across multiple contexts, tracking, if you will, I think that will help solve many of these issues. That's where the underlying problem is. It's what, as Martin described, it's what makes the eyeball on the Macedonian piece of fake content almost as valuable and more profitable than a piece of content from The Guardian or the New York Times, which is a fundamental problem. And so we really need that enforcement across contexts. The only other thing I do want to say while we're here is the Democracy Disrupted report that has the same name as this panel was absolutely phenomenal. And as somebody representing America, I just want to applaud the work that's been done by the ICO, the Commissioner's Office. I think the international collaboration and paying attention across borders is super valuable, and so we appreciate that too. So,
thank you. We've got 2 minutes before the academically rigorous bell tolls, so maybe if I could hand over back to our chair, unless Lisa Maria, you have anything burning to add. Commissioner Denham, what do we take away from this discussion?
There are the same discussion. The discussion that we had this afternoon is happening in parliaments in Canada, in the US, it's happening in the UK. Experts in panels like this are having these discussions. What we're really talking about, what we talked about this afternoon, was really the combination. It's about power. So the concentration of personal data in the hands of tech companies, monopolies, the structure and the business model of ad tech, the disruption of the traditional model of news media and journalism, all of these things are undermining our democracy. They are isolating people from public debate, which is really important. I think these models also send people into filter bubbles, which again creates ethical and social issues. So what I'm hearing from pretty much everyone on this panel and from parliamentarians in discussions like at the Grand Committee of Parliament is that we do need a big bang. We need to look fundamentally at the business models that we've created here, stronger laws, stronger regulation, enforcement of the laws we have, but new powers and new laws because this is an international problem. And it was a sobering discussion this afternoon, but I really appreciate being part of it. And we need to keep talking. We need to get our parliamentarians to make changes. Thank you.
Thank you. On the 11th of February, there will be an event in Brussels called Europe Votes 2019, How to Unmask and Fight Online Manipulation. And it will be, you can register for it, it's free, or you can follow it online, it will be streamed. And we'll have a number of people in the room speaking. And that will be to go into greater depth about some of these topics. So I just wanted to say thank you for your time, Jason, Lisa Maria, and Louise, Martin, and Commissioner Denham. And thank you all for your engagement and attention.